Writing a first chapter that is going to hook readers, agents, and editors is tough. So, where do you start? I'm going to share some common first chapter mistakes that I learnt from before I got published with a Big Five publisher. They eventually led me to coming runner-up in a best opening chapter competition and various other prize listings for my novel, so hopefully they'll help you too. So let's get started. Don't wait to hook the reader. Make the first line sparkle and grab attention. That very first line needs to be killer. The reader might know nothing about you or your book, so it's got to grab attention, and it's got to work really hard to keep people reading or even to buy your book in the first place. So some ways you can do this is by setting up a question or introducing an intriguing situation or character. So let's look at a couple of examples now. If you're going to read this, don't bother. That's the first line from Choke by Chuck Palahniuk. I absolutely love this. It's audacious, it's bold, it sets a tone, and it immediately makes you wonder why you wouldn't bother to read it. I bet you didn't know that bleach masks the smell of blood. And that's the first line from My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. Again, this one is setting up tension and making us wonder exactly what the narrator is trying to hide. And I also like the way it draws the reader by talking directly to us. I bet you didn't know. So think about how you can build that intrigue in your very first line. Let's go on to the next step. Don't info dump. Only include the necessary info for the chapter. So when you're writing a first chapter, I know it's tempting to try and tell the reader everything you possibly can as quickly as you can, but they don't need to know everything straight away. And world building is of course important, and there's definitely a balance to be struck to make your reader believe in the world that you're creating. But for the first chapter, you can try making a list of the key things a reader actually needs to know. So this might include who's the main character or characters. Is the setting clear enough for a reader to picture the world? You don't have to describe every detail. In my novel, I use just a few lines, like the buzz of a tinny transistor radio, to give that sense of time and place. And is there enough intrigue for a reader to keep reading? Which brings me on to the next tip. Don't explain everything. Plant questions in readers' minds to build tension. So a common mistake from writers is to try and explain everything, but that can just sometimes overwhelm the reader, and it's also not an interesting way to tell a story. Instead, think about planting some questions in the reader's mind from the beginning. And you might not need to answer some until the next chapter or the middle of the book or even the end of the book. And there's psychology behind this. There's a great book by Will Storr called The Science of Storytelling that goes into the reasons why. Humans are curious beings, and as writers, we can keep readers reading by building what Will Storr calls information gaps. Will Storr says, change is hope, change is promise. When unexpected change strikes, we want to know, what does it mean? Is this change for the good or the bad? Unexpected change makes us more curious, and curiosity is how we should feel in the opening movements of an effective story. So plant those questions to keep the reader turning the pages. Next tip, don't start with a cliche unless you have a very good reason. Surprise the reader. One of the first things you're taught in creative writing is don't start a novel with someone waking up or a dream or the weather. Now there are some good exceptions to this rule. So George Orwell's 1984 starts with a description of the weather, and The Hunger Games begins with Katniss waking up. But nowadays, and at the pace we live especially, we need to cut to the chase and surprise the reader with something different. And just to address the point, it's not that you can't start with waking up, but you have to have a very good reason. If your character wakes up and their husband doesn't come to bed the previous night, maybe there's a good reason. But generally, agents and editors are a little wary of stories that start with the beginning of a day rather than the middle of the story itself. And they're expecting you to get into the core focus immediately, which is why the next tip is Don't start too early, get straight into the story. When you're thinking about your first chapter, it's very possible you've started your novel earlier than you actually need to. You can cut straight to the action. You don't have to have someone coming into a room before they have an argument. You can try starting in the middle of that argument and explaining what you need as you go. And that can apply to any chapter, but especially in the first chapter. So you want to plant a seed. Why are they arguing? Who are these people? In Sarah Collins' novel, The Confessions of Franny Langton, we meet the main character in prison, awaiting the start of her murder trial in the very first chapter. So we already have questions about the character. Why are they in prison? Who have they murdered? And so on. You can't give your reader any excuse to put the book down, so hook them from the beginning by getting into the story immediately. Don't start with lots of people. Introduce your main characters. So one of the mistakes some writers make is that with their first chapter, they introduce lots of people all at once. You might have more than one main character, and I actually had 3 point of view characters in my debut novel, but I only introduced 2 of them in that first chapter. If you bombard the reader with lots of new characters, new names, and new descriptions, they might not be able to keep track of everyone. And remember that the reader doesn't know the world as well as you do, so they're still trying to find their way. You can definitely have a scene with a few characters, but party scenes are sometimes best left for further in the novel. And before we move to the next tip, if you like this video and would like to see more on writing, publishing, and marketing, make sure you comment and subscribe. So the next tip is don't just focus on action, create emotion and make the reader care. When you're writing a first chapter, it's just as important to hook the reader with emotion. If you're going to hold a reader's attention for hundreds of pages, they have to care about something, and ideally someone in the story, usually your main character. And you can do that by introducing a universal theme, so something that most readers can identify with. Themes like belonging, love, family, and security are things that can bring the reader closer to your character and give them something to really root for. In my novel, Kololo Hill, one of my main characters was a 50-something Indian woman in the 1970s called Jaya. So I had to make sure readers cared about her, even though she was probably quite different to most of the readers of my novel. And by focusing on the things that my character Jaya cared about, so her independence, her home, her family, I could build a familiar connection with the reader. And it doesn't mean your characters have to be likeable, but your reader does need to care enough to keep reading. Next tip, don't forget to move the plot forward, give the story motion. So this applies to every single chapter, from the start of a chapter to the end. Every single chapter, something needs to have shifted in the story to move it forward. Perhaps it's a reveal, perhaps it's a new character, but it doesn't just have to be a huge dramatic change with lots of action. It can be internal, where a character changes their own perspective on something that later leads to a different decision. So take a look at some of the opening chapters of your favourite books for ideas on how they move the story forward. And the next tip is don't include a prologue if your story doesn't need one. Can you start the novel in a different place? So does your novel need a prologue as the first chapter? Often a prologue is where the first chapter is actually from somewhere far later in the story, or a prologue can have a different feel and style to the rest of the book before the first chapter properly kicks in. So they're often used to plant those early questions and build intrigue, or to hint at something that isn't coming until much later in the story. So it's essentially a jump cut sometimes. And some agents and editors can be a little bit funny about prologues. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't include them, and they're particularly common in certain genres like thrillers, but there has to be a really good reason to use these. Always ask yourself whether the point of your prologue is taken from is actually where the story needs to start. So I hope these tips on first chapters was useful. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, you might like to check out this one on writing a query letter next.